Marlene, turn around.
Please.
The accounts, the checks that you cared for.
No, I would never do that to anyone.
Marlene Ostrander operated without oversight for 6 years as a hospice nurse in Port Charlotte, Florida. 11 dying patients trusted her with their mail, their medication, and their bank accounts. Not one person checked.
You have to believe me.
Your handwriting,
That's not what happened.
11 patients
Please,
by their
don't
initials.
understand,
She would not get the chance to walk back through that doorway. Within 48 hours, detectives from the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office would seize her work bag, her phone, her personal laptop, and a spiral-bound notebook tucked behind the spare tire in the trunk of her Toyota Camry. 11 patients, roughly $480,000. 4 years of scheduled hospice visits to people who would not live long enough to notice what she was doing. What investigators found written inside that notebook would explain something the surviving families had never been able to explain on their own: why their dying parents had so little left in the bank. Quick question before we go any further. Have you ever handed a stranger the keys to a parent's house because you trusted the uniform they were wearing? Drop your story in the comments. And if you're new here, subscribe. This channel covers the cases where the betrayal happened inside the front door every single week. Marlene Dolores Ostrander was born in Wauchula, Florida in 1975. Her father worked the citrus groves east of town, 15 years on the Tropicana payroll, before a forklift accident in 1989 took 2 fingers off his right hand and forced him onto permanent disability. Her mother cleaned rooms at a Days Inn off Highway 17 and worked the dinner shift at a Cracker Barrel in Bartow. The Ostrander family lived in a 2-bedroom rental on the east side of Wauchula. Marlene shared a room with her younger sister Brandy until she was 17 years old. Friends from her childhood remembered her as the quiet sister, the careful one, the girl who took notes during church sermons in a marbled composition book. Teachers at Hardy High School described her in yearbook captions and later in interviews with state investigators as responsible, mature for her age, and the kind of student who returned library books 2 days early. She graduated in 1993, near the top half of her class, but college was never seriously on the table. Her family did not have the money. Her father, by then largely housebound, needed someone to drive him to appointments at the VA clinic in Bay Pines. So Marlene stayed close to home. She took a job at a Winn-Dixie in Wauchula, stocking the dairy section for $7.25 an hour. 2 years later, she enrolled in a licensed practical nursing program at South Florida State College in Avon Park. It was a 54-week program. She completed it in 1997. Her clinical instructors signed off on her rotations with notes describing her as detail-oriented, calm under pressure, and exceptionally patient with elderly patients who required repeated explanation. Her first job after passing the NCLEX PN was at a long-term care facility in Sebring called Highlands Manor. She worked the 3 to 11 shift, dispensing medication to 72 residents across 2 wings. She stayed for 9 years. Performance reviews from that period, later subpoenaed by Florida investigators, used phrases like reliable charge nurse, trusted with controlled substance counts, and preferred by families during end-of-life transitions. One review, written in 2003 by a director of nursing named Yvette Cardoza, described Marlene as the kind of nurse you assign to the patients no one else wants. That language would appear in a sentencing memo 22 years later. In 2006, she married a man named Curtis Ostrander, a heating and air technician from Punta Gorda. They moved into a small stucco house on Loveland Boulevard in Port Charlotte, 3 bedrooms, 1 bath, a sabal palm in the side yard, and a concrete back porch with a screened lanai. They never had children. Curtis filed for divorce in 2013. The court file is sparse. Marriage counseling, irreconcilable differences. She kept the house. She kept her married surname. She kept the dog, a 14-year-old beagle named Cooper, who would die 3 years later. By 2018, Marlene had been a licensed practical nurse in the state of Florida for 21 years. She had worked at 3 different facilities. She had never been written up. She had never had a complaint filed against her by a patient or a family member. Her license had been renewed on time, every 2 years for over 2 decades. That same year, she accepted a position as a field hospice nurse for a regional end-of-life care provider operating across Charlotte and Sarasota counties. The job paid $48,000 a year plus mileage reimbursement, which on the kind of routes she would soon volunteer for added another $6,000 to $7,000 annually. It was the job she had spent her entire career preparing for. It was also the job that would put her alone in the homes of dying strangers. Hospice care in Florida is not a building. It is not a wing of a hospital or a section of a nursing home. It is a service delivered to a patient's address. A field hospice nurse arrives at the patient's home, performs an assessment, manages pain medication, monitors symptoms, communicates with the attending physician, and leaves. The visit might last 45 minutes. It might last 3 hours. In a typical week, a field nurse visits 8 to 12 patients spread across 2 counties, driving between 300 and 500 miles in her own personal vehicle. The patients Marlene was assigned shared a clinical profile: terminal diagnosis, prognosis of 6 months or less, a do not resuscitate order already in the chart in most cases. Many had been moved to home hospice precisely because the family had decided against further hospital treatment. Some had children flying in from Ohio or New Jersey. Some did not. Some had no one at all. Within the hospice agency, Marlene developed a quiet reputation. She was the nurse who took the hard cases, the patients with thin emergency contact fields, the men whose wives had been dead for a decade, the women whose only son lived in Anchorage and could not afford the flight. Colleagues at the agency would later tell investigators that Marlene volunteered for these cases. She asked for them. She traded shifts with other nurses to take them. Her supervisor, a registered nurse named Patricia Lensing, would say in a recorded interview that Marlene's willingness to take the isolated patients was, at the time, considered one of her greatest professional strengths. The system trusted her by design. Field nurses operate without daily supervision. The agency tracked her visits through an electronic charting system on a company-issued tablet, but the chart only recorded clinical information: vital signs, medication administered, pain scale. It did not record what else happened in the house. It did not record what mail she opened. It did not record what conversation she had with a sedated patient about a checkbook on the kitchen counter. Hospice patients are not in a position to audit anything. They are dying. Many are on morphine. Many are sleeping 18 hours a day. Their families, when present, are exhausted, grieving in advance, and grateful for any help. The nurse who shows up 3 times a week with a stethoscope and a smile is not someone you watch. She is someone you thank. That trust was the structure. The structure was the vulnerability. And Marlene, by every account from her colleagues at the agency, understood that vulnerability better than anyone else on the team. The first incident that investigators were able to date with certainty occurred in October of 2020. The patient was a 78-year-old retired Florida power and light lineman named Harold Vanek. He had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer in August. He had been moved to home hospice in September. His wife had died in 2014. His only daughter lived in Cleveland and visited once every 6 weeks. Marlene was assigned to his case on September 28th. Her first visit was on October 1st. By October 14th, she had volunteered to help him organize his mail. By October 21st, she was paying his electric bill and his water bill from his checking account. By October 27th, she had written the first check. It was for $270, made out to cash. Drawn on Mr. Vanek's checking account at Suncoast Credit Union, endorsed on the back in Marlene Ostrander's handwriting, cashed at a Suncoast branch on Tamiami Trail in Port Charlotte on a Wednesday afternoon. Mr. Vanek died on November 18th. The check had cleared 17 days before his death. He never noticed it was missing because by the time it cleared, he was sleeping 19 hours a day and could no longer focus his eyes on a bank statement. The method, investigators would later piece together, followed a pattern that did not vary across 4 years and 11 patients. Marlene would identify the right patient within the first 2 visits. Living alone, or functionally alone. No nearby family. Cognitive impairment ranging from mild to severe. Significant savings. A checkbook somewhere in the house. Often a debit card in a kitchen drawer. She would offer to help. The offer was always framed as a kindness. Your son is in Indianapolis, honey. I can drop these in the mail on my way home. Don't worry about the cable bill. I'll take care of it on the app for you. If you sign this here, I can run to the pharmacy without bothering you. The offers were appropriate. They were the kinds of offers a good hospice nurse might genuinely make. The line between care and exploitation was thin, and Marlene had spent years learning where it sat. Once she had access, the withdrawals began. They were small and irregular. $270, $440, $1,600. Never round numbers. Never the same amount twice in a row. She avoided the four-figure thresholds that banks tend to flag. She avoided drawing on a single account too frequently. She concentrated activity in the 7 days before a patient's death, when sedation made oversight impossible, and in the 14 days after, when the estate had not yet been opened and no one was yet watching the accounts. For 3 patients, she went further. She filled out the bank's authorized user paperwork in the patient's living room and walked the dying man or woman through signing it. She framed it, according to one surviving family member who later testified, as a way to make sure your bills get paid if you can't get to the bank yourself. The patient signed. The bank processed the form. Marlene's name was now on the account. She used those 3 accounts more aggressively than the others, because once she was on the signature card, she did not need a check at all. She could walk into any Suncoast branch and withdraw cash directly. Her colleagues at the hospice agency saw none of this. Her supervisor reviewed her clinical charting weekly and found nothing amiss. Her mileage reports were submitted on time. Her continuing education credits were current. She attended the monthly staff meeting at the agency's Port Charlotte office. She brought a green bean casserole to the holiday potluck in December of 2022 and stayed an hour longer than anyone else to help clean up the break room. She was, by every visible measure, exactly what she appeared to be. By the end of 2023, she had stolen from 9 patients. By the time the investigation broke, that number was 11. On February 4, 2024, a 71-year-old widower named Donald Pruitt died in his bed at his home on Edgewater Drive in Port Charlotte. Mr. Pruitt had been Marlene's patient for 9 months. He had stage 4 prostate cancer that had metastasized to his spine. His 2 adult children lived in Boise and Raleigh. Neither had been able to be present for the death. The funeral home that arrived to collect Mr. Pruitt's body recorded his time of death as 6:42 a.m. 2 days later, on February 6th, a debit card belonging to Donald Pruitt was used at a Best Buy on Daniels Parkway in Fort Myers. The transaction was for $912.47. The card was swiped at 3:18 p.m. The purchase included a 55-inch television and a sound bar. A fraud detection algorithm at Mr. Pruitt's Bank, a regional institution headquartered in Tampa, flagged the transaction. The flag was not triggered by the dollar amount. The flag was triggered because the bank's records cross-referenced against a death certificate database. The cardholder had been reported deceased 45 hours earlier. A bank fraud analyst in Tampa, a 34-year-old woman named Priscilla Hooper, opened the file at 9:14 a.m. on February 7th. By 11:30 that morning, she had pulled the prior 90 days of activity on Mr. Pruitt's accounts. She found 7 additional transactions that gave her pause. Small checks made out to cash. ATM withdrawals from a Suncoast branch in Port Charlotte during business hours on weekdays when, according to Mr. Pruitt's hospice schedule, he had been bedridden and unable to drive. Ms. Hooper escalated the file to her supervisor. The supervisor escalated it to the bank's legal department. The bank's legal department contacted Mr. Pruitt's emergency contact, a 48-year-old project manager in Boise named Wesley Pruitt. Wesley Pruitt called the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office at 4:51 p.m. on February 8th. He spoke to a desk sergeant. The sergeant transferred him to a detective in the Financial Crimes Unit. The detective took the report. By the following Monday, a search warrant had been drafted for the bank's full records on Mr. Pruitt's accounts. The investigation was 11 days old before Marlene Ostrander's name appeared on a single document. The detective who took the case was a 15-year veteran of the sheriff's office named Sergeant Reagan Aldermeyer. Aldermeyer had spent 8 years on patrol and 7 in financial crimes. She had worked elder exploitation cases before. She knew the pattern. The first thing she pulled was Mr. Pruitt's hospice agency records. The agency cooperated immediately. They turned over Mr. Pruitt's chart, his visit schedule for the prior 9 months, and the personnel file of his assigned field nurse, Marlene Dolores Ostrander, LPN. 6 years with the agency. No prior complaints. No disciplinary actions. A photograph clipped to the inside cover of the file showed a woman with light brown hair and a thin, polite smile. Aldermeyer cross-referenced Marlene's visit schedule against the suspicious transactions on Mr. Pruitt's accounts. Every check made out to cash had been written and cashed on a day Marlene had visited the house. Every ATM withdrawal had occurred within 90 minutes of a logged visit. The branch location was a Suncoast Credit Union on Tamiami Trail. The branch had surveillance cameras. The cameras had retention going back 90 days. By February 14th, Aldermeyer had ATM stills of Marlene Ostrander in scrubs, withdrawing $200 from Mr. Pruitt's account on a Wednesday afternoon. The timestamp on the surveillance footage was 2:47 p.m. The timestamp on her hospice charting note for that same visit was 12:30 to 1:45 p.m. She had finished the visit, driven 7 minutes to the branch, withdrawn the cash, driven back to the patient's neighborhood, and then driven home. Aldermeyer expanded the investigation. She pulled the hospice agency's roster of Marlene's patients, going back 4 years. There had been 31 of them, all deceased. She began contacting the surviving family members one at a time. The pattern emerged within a week. 11 of the 31 estates had unexplained losses, small checks, cash withdrawals. In 3 cases, the patient had signed authorized user paperwork that the family had never seen and the patient had never mentioned. The dollar amount climbed: $40,000, $80,000, $190,000. By the end of February, the working total was $350,000. By mid-March, with additional accounts located, it had reached approximately $480,000. The single largest loss was attributed to a widower with late-stage cancer, whose adult children lived out of state. The figure was approximately $96,000. If you are still with me, thank you. The case is about to get worse. The investigators were about to find something inside her car that turned a financial crimes case into a question about whether this woman had been planning this from the first day she walked into a hospice patient's living room. Subscribe before we get there. This kind of accountability reporting needs more eyes on it. On March 19, 2024, Sergeant Aldermeyer executed a search warrant on Marlene Ostrander's home on Loveland Boulevard, her workplace locker at the hospice agency's Port Charlotte office, and her personal vehicle. The vehicle was a 2019 Toyota Camry, dark gray, parked in her driveway. Deputies searched the trunk. Behind the spare tire, wrapped in a Walmart plastic bag, they found a spiral-bound notebook. The notebook had no name on the cover. Inside, on lined college-ruled paper, were 4 years of entries. Each entry consisted of a set of initials, a dollar figure, and a date. HV, $270, 10 to 27/20. DM, $1,640, 3 to 14/21. R. K, $445, 6 Jo 2, 21. The initials matched her patients. The dates matched her visit schedule. The dollar figures matched the canceled checks the bank had already produced. Prosecutors would later refer to this notebook in court filings as a ledger of access. But the single piece of evidence that would foreclose any possibility of a defense was a canceled check. The check was drawn on the account of a patient named Rosalind Kessler. It was made out to cash. The amount was $1,500. The handwriting on the payee line and on the signature line was, according to a Florida Department of Law Enforcement handwriting analyst, consistent with samples taken from Marlene Ostrander's hospice charting notes. The date written on the check was February 22, 2022. Rosalind Kessler's date of death, as recorded by the funeral home and confirmed by the State of Florida Vital Records Office, was February 20th, 2022, 2 days before the check was written. The bank's posting timestamp confirmed it. Ms. Kessler had been embalmed and placed in her casket before the ink on the check was dry. At 6:47 a.m. on March 20th, 2024, Marlene Ostrander walked out the front door of her house on Loveland Boulevard, carrying a travel mug of coffee and a folded scrub top over her arm. She was scheduled to be at the hospice agency's office by 7:15. 3 unmarked vehicles were parked along the curb. Sergeant Aldermeyer and 2 financial crimes detectives were waiting on the front walk. Aldermeyer identified herself. She presented the arrest warrant. She explained the charges: grand theft, exploitation of an elderly or disabled adult, fraudulent use of personal identification, multiple counts. Marlene set the coffee mug on the hood of her car. She did not run. She did not raise her voice. She did not, according to the body cam footage later released as part of discovery, change her facial expression in any visible way. She asked one question: Marlene Ostrander, "Is this about the Pruitt account?" Sergeant Aldermeyer did not answer. She read Marlene her Miranda rights. She asked Marlene if she understood them. Marlene said she did. Then Marlene asked a second question. Marlene Ostrander, "Did his son call you?" Aldermeyer still did not answer. She asked Marlene if she wished to make a statement. Marlene paused for what body cam timestamps put at 4 full seconds. Then she said she wanted to call her lawyer. She did not say anything else. Not when she was handcuffed. Not when she was placed in the back of the patrol vehicle. Not when she was photographed and fingerprinted at the Charlotte County Jail intake that morning. The only words she had spoken to investigators were the names of 2 of her patients. Marlene Ostrander was indicted by a Charlotte County grand jury on May 9, 2024. The indictment ran to 41 pages and listed 31 separate counts. 11 counts of grand theft under Florida Statute 812. 0 rings. 11 counts of exploitation of an elderly person or disabled adult under Florida Statute 825. 103. 9 counts of fraudulent use of personal identification under Florida Statute 8117. 5 and 68. Her defense attorney was a Fort Myers criminal lawyer named Brendan Tilghman. Tilghman filed 3 motions to suppress in the months that followed. A motion to suppress the notebook on the grounds that the search of the spare tire compartment exceeded the scope of the warrant. A motion to suppress the bank records on a chain of custody argument. A motion to suppress Marlene's 2-question exchange with Sergeant Aldermeyer as a violation of her Miranda rights. All 3 motions were denied. The handwriting analysis and the bank's posting time records on the Kessler check were ruled admissible at a pretrial hearing in November. On January 13, 2025, Marlene Ostrander appeared in the 20th Judicial Circuit, Charlotte County, before Judge Imogene Whitlow. She entered a guilty plea to consolidated counts. The plea agreement made no representations about sentencing. She would be sentenced cold. The sentencing hearing took place on March 7, 2025. 3 families gave victim impact statements. Wesley Pruitt, the son of Donald Pruitt, spoke first. He described coming home from his father's funeral to discover that his father's accounts had been drained to within $400 of zero. He described what it felt like to learn that the nurse who had held his father's hand in the final days had also been writing herself checks against his father's name during those same days. He used the word vulture. He used it twice. The second statement was given by Rosalind Kessler's niece, Adelaide Brewster. She read from a prepared sheet of paper. She said her aunt had trusted Marlene Ostrander with everything in those last weeks. With the mail, with the morphine, with the password to the email account where the bank statements arrived. She said her aunt had died believing she was being cared for. She said that belief had been the last thing taken from her. The third statement was read by an attorney on behalf of the daughter of a patient named Doris May Holloway. The daughter could not travel. She lived in Bismarck, North Dakota. The attorney read her words slowly. The words ended with a single sentence. My mother died alone, and the only person in the room was the person stealing from her. Judge Whitlow spoke for 9 minutes before pronouncing sentence. She addressed Marlene directly. She said that in 23 years on the bench, she had presided over many cases involving the exploitation of vulnerable adults. She said she had rarely seen a case in which the exploitation was so deliberate, so sustained, and so cynically organized. She referenced the notebook. She said the notebook was not the work of a person who had been swept up in a momentary lapse of judgment. The notebook was the work of a person who had treated dying patients as accounts to be drawn down. She said the fact that Marlene had volunteered, repeatedly, for the patients with the fewest family connections was, in the court's view, an aggravating factor and not a mitigating one. She said no nurse should ever again be in a room with a vulnerable adult and the keys to that adult's money. She sentenced Marlene Ostrander to 12 years in Florida State Prison. She ordered restitution in the full amount of $480,000. She imposed 5 years of probation to begin upon release. The Florida Board of Nursing entered a separate order 1 week later, permanently revoking Marlene Ostrander's licensed practical nurse license and barring her from any future application for licensure in the state of Florida. Marlene Ostrander is currently incarcerated at Lowell Correctional Institution in Ocala, Florida. Her projected release date is in 2036. She will be 60 years old when she walks out. She will never again hold a Florida nursing license. She will never again sit on a floral couch beside a stranger in pajamas and offer to help with the mail. The notebook is sealed in an evidence locker at the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office. There are 43 pages of entries in it. Investigators believe at least 4 of the entries do not match any of the 11 identified victims. The initials behind those entries have not been matched to a name. The families have not been notified because there are no families to notify. That was a story about a nurse who kept books. The next case on the right side of your screen is worse. Click it now.